Okay, let's begin. Just a quick reminder for those there's always someone who says they don't know about this. There is a YBT Hashkafa podcast, okay, that if you like me, are bothered by listening to things, and then every time you open your phone again, then it switches, with a podcast, it'll hold the place, so you can like listen to it there. Also find it on my Machshava Lab podcast and on my YouTube channel. So the shiur is called Sforno on the Nachash, Apikorsus or Pshat. And I'm calling this part one, methodology and premises, but we'll see that things might change. Okay, quick introduction. The impetus for the shiur is the first 6 words of the Sforno's commentary on the Nachash, which is V'hanachash hu Satan hu yetzer hara. All right, so the snake is the Satan, which is the yetzer hara. Okay, very tantalizing thing. I don't remember when I first saw it, but I just remembered, being like blown away by that. And the question I was interested in this year was, how exactly does the Sforno understand the cheit and then the aftermath, especially what happens to the Nachash? Like if the Nachash is the yetzer hara, so then what's the whole dialogue with Chava? And that part's easier to understand because you could have a dialogue with your yetzer hara, but like God, changing the Nachash and like it crawling on its belly and that whole thing, that was just a general question I was interested in. So I wanted to give a shiur on this. And then I realized that there's 2 major problems. Problem number 1 is I think I really first need to establish how Sforno learns tzelem elohim. Okay, and the inside joke is that anytime this comes up in one of my shiurim, I say I'll just summarize it. I'm not going to read it because if I read it, I'll end up giving a shiur on it, and then I usually end up reading it and giving a shiur on it. So I figured it needs to be its own shiur. But then the big problem is I'm pretty sure Rebbe holds that this kind of approach is wrong, dangerous, and heretical. Okay. And if I were giving this shiur in another context, then like I could choose whether to address that. But I feel like it's very inappropriate to give a Sunday shiur in Yeshiva B'nai Torah on something that Rebbe holds is heretical without addressing that. Okay, so those are the 2 obstacles. And so the solution that I came up with was to give a part 1 today to address those 2 problems, and then a part 2 where we actually take up the Nachash. So I kind of want to establish all of the methodology and the premises. Well, I'll show you the outline. So the plan is going to be like this. Today, after this quick introduction, we're going to talk about Rebbe's objections to allegorizing the Nachash. Okay. Then we're going to talk about the Abravanel's objections to allegorizing the Nachash because they overlap with Rebbe's. Then we're going to go to the Abravanel's defense of those who do allegorize the Nachash. And then we're going to speculate, okay, on what Rebbe might say about that. And one of the other benefits of having this shiur in 2 parts is that hopefully people will then think about this on their own. People will talk to Rebbe, people will talk to each other, people will listen to the shiur, and we'll be able to like better ready ourselves for part 2. Okay. And then premises is we're going to talk about the Sforno on the creation of Adam. Okay, in Breshis, Prakim, Aleph, and Beis, which is the basis for understanding how he learns Perek Gimel. Okay, and part 2 we don't know when that's going to be. All right, but that's when we'll take up Sforno's explanation. I'm slightly worried. You'll if you ever listen to Rebbe's Chumash shiur, which we're going to talk about in a second, you'll see that he starts talking and it sounds like he didn't plan for the first minute to take a long time because a lot of people had a lot of things to say about like allegorizing the Nachash. So what I'm worried about is that we will only get through the methodology today. So it's possible we'll just focus on methodology and then do a part 2 on Sforno, creation of man, and then part 3 on the Nachash. We'll see. Okay, not going to rush anything. Quick word on the resources I used. I've talked about this before. Sforno on the Torah, the 2-volume Rav Yehuda Cooperman is the best one with all the annotations. The translation of Sforno's commentary by Rabbi Pelkovitz is excellent. Do not use the translation of Rabbi Eliyahu Monk. Okay, I've been meaning to write an article about this. Rabbi Monk's Beshita does not translate. Okay, he paraphrases and inserts his own Torah. Okay, and he says this in an article about his translation philosophy. Unfortunately, it's good if you want to learn a shiur, right? But if you're looking for a translation, Eliyahu Monk has a lot of translations, and the one on Sfaria and Al Torah for the Sforno is Eliyahu Monk. But if you think you're reading a translation, you're not. He'll insert ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with what the Mefarish says. So just be aware of that. The Kisvei Rav Ovadia Sforno, published by Mosad Rav Kook, is an excellent edition, which has his Or Amim, which is like, quote unquote, his more Nevuchim, where he does something similar to what the Rambam does. Which I'm going to quote from. Sforno's works on Al Torah are almost all annotated by Rabbi Moshe Kravitz, who's the one who's doing his PhD on Sforno's student. And basically all of his footnotes will cross-reference you to everywhere else in the Sforno's works. and you'll get the full picture. I mean, we've done this in my Sunday shiur in the past. That's very good. Then I've mentioned this as well, the shiuri Rav Ovadia Sforno. So for those who haven't heard, I call this the director's cut of the Sforno's commentary. Basically, he had a student named Rabbi Dinola, who was in his Chumash shiur and took extensive notes on the Sforno's Chumash shiur. And so what you get is more elaborate, clarified versions of what the Sforno says in his commentary. You also get updated ideas, because I asked Rav Moshe Kravitz, who published this, what came first, and he said that Elia Danola's commentary came later. So if you're going to rely on one, rely on the commentary, and it's just a beautiful, just extra Sforno stuff, and you can find out in all Torah in the drop-down menu under Sforno. Okay, then I also want to have a shout out to I think David Fishbein showed this to me, Sofer AI, which is the AI transcription software, okay? So in the olden days, we had a system, and the system is you ask Esther or Joey Lichter, have you taken notes on such and such a tape in TTL? And they will have taken painstaking notes, okay, which is very helpful, still a good system. But so for AI, you just upload a shiur, and then it uses AI and creates a full transcript, okay? Now, right now, it's about, I'd say 80% accurate. So, you can't just like substitute this for the shiur, but you can, what this allowed me to do is you could click on any of the words and it plays the audio as it's going. So if you need to find anything in any shiur, you can just do Control F and find it. Right now, I think it is, you can only upload like a 40-minute shiur or something like that. So I had to like clip this. So shout out to that. And the other thing also, which again, I talk about this in my shiur, and why not talk about it here? ChatGPT 4.0. I mean, I'm now in the habit of everything I'm learning and everything I write and all the sources I use, I put into my ChatGPT so that I can easily think stuff out loud and find stuff. Maybe I'll demonstrate that a little bit later with the response. Okay, so let's now talk about the methodology. Okay, so we're going to start with Rebbe's objections to allegorizing the Nachash. So first and foremost, everyone should listen to C107 to 108. Okay, it's called the snake. Okay, it's one of my favorite Chumash shiurim that Rebbe gives. The reason why you should listen to it, as far as I'm concerned for here, is first of all, you should hear his full shita. Okay, if we had infinite time, I would play the full thing and then give my shiur, but I can't do that, so I'm just going to give excerpts. But you should listen to his full shita, which is mostly in the first 26 minutes is where he addresses this question of, is it acceptable to allegorize the Nachash? And then he gives the main part of the shiur after that. You should also listen to this to form your own assessment of what his shita is. Because I remember this, I've listened to this many times throughout my time in yeshiva. And like the thing that stood out in my mind is Rebbe just saying this is a dangerous Apikorsus approach. And then when I listened to it this time, I realized, as one often does when you listen to a shiur again, it's much more nuanced than I thought. And it's also unclear what his shita is. Okay, so you should form your own opinion of what his shita is, not just take my word for it, and then also your judgment of that shita. And then the third thing, this is the primary reason, is it's an amazing Chumash shiur because he gives a shiur on the assumption that the Nachash should be read literally. Okay, and it's a beautiful. I mean, I don't need to praise Rabbi shiur, but it's like if you want a good shiur on the Nachash, like I can't think of a better one than this one. Okay. And the shiurim are C107 and 108. 107 is an hour and 34 minutes, and then 108 is 34 minutes. So it's about 2 hours. Okay, very good. All right, so everyone should listen to that and not rely on my assessment. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quote excerpts from Rebbe's shiur, and what I've attempted to do is when I say that you have to form your own assessment of what his shita is, he'll say that he has one objection, but it really sounds like 2 or 3 objections. So what I've done is I've color coded the phrases where I think he's having his 3 objections to allegorizing the Nachash, and they're all interrelated. Okay, so he says you have to be the very opening of the shiur. You have to be very careful what you do with questions like this. Okay, about the Nachash being allegorical. I mean, there are certain approaches that are legitimate and certain approaches that are not legitimate. Okay, in my opinion, it's not legitimate to just say that the Nachash is symbolic of the yetzer hara or something like that. That's not legitimate. That's not a legitimate approach for a very simple reason. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second. We're going to treat that as the one-line summary of his shita, which is it's not legitimate to say that Nachash is a symbolic of the yetzer hara, which is exactly what the Sforno says. This is why I was a little nervous, okay? But then he goes on and he says the reasons. He says, because if you introduce an approach, it has to be consistent. Logic dictates that there should be some consistency here. So if you're going to say the Nachash is a metaphor, so maybe Vayihu Shnei Marumim, that they were both naked, is a metaphor. Maybe Vayishmu es kol Hashem Elohim mishalach gan l'ruach hayom is also a metaphor, that they heard the voice of Hashem Elohim walking in the garden by the ruach of the day. Now, if you're thinking like me, I thought that was a metaphor. Okay, so that's why you need to listen to the shiur. Okay, Rebbe goes and he says that Chazal learned halachos and principles from the plain Pshat, which indicates that that they didn't just take it as a metaphor. Then he says, but to my mind, to say that the Nachash is a metaphor is a very dangerous kind of approach, because then you're getting into an approach where you can metaphorize the entire Torah. You could say Moshe and Aaron was a metaphor. You could say Mitzrayim was a metaphor. You could say that Adam and Chava was a metaphor. Of course, the method of understanding the Torah is that behind the surface material, there are deep ideas. That's correct, but we don't deny the surface material. Once you do that, then I think you're opening up the door. First of all, it's not consistent because everything is pshuto shel mikra. And all of a sudden, this one thing is a complete metaphor. By the way, the reason why I can't give you a full transcript, and this is one of the frustrating things about the shiur, is Rebbe starts giving the shiur, and then people just start pelting him with questions, and you can't always hear what he's responding to, so it's very like broken up. Okay, that's why I think part of why he's not being unclear, but just as we know from these tapes, like it's on and off. And he says, that's why I'm saying is like this. A person has to be consistent. If you're ready to say the Nachash is a metaphor, then you have to be ready to say everything else is a metaphor. And the question is, are we really ready to do that? I don't think the Baalei Masorah are ready to do that. If you do that, you're throwing away all the Baalei Masorah and all the Chazal. If you do that, in my opinion, you're opening the door to destroying Kol HaTorah Kula. You can't do that. First of all, it's against our whole method of interpretation. Again, this is all from different parts of the first 26 minutes. First of all, it's against our whole method of interpretation. Secondly, it's inconsistent. It's inconsistent. So just to give an answer to a difficult parsha, in my opinion, we have an old rule, and that is, Lamed Lashonach Lomar Ein Yodea. Teach your tongue to say, I don't know. So I don't know the Pshat, but not to introduce new methodology, which actually destroys the whole Torah, basically. Okay, in short, you have to be consistent. Okay, you can see it's like he's talking about this as though it's one thing. I think there are three arguments, though, three objections. One, and this is, again, my understanding, that an approach like that is inconsistent, okay? To just say that the Nachash is a metaphor and everything else is not, that's like picking and choosing. That's just, you have to have some principles. You can't just like fabricate an approach based on this one particular that you can't understand. Objection number two is it goes against the approaches of the Baalei Masorah. Okay, and he says that many times. Okay, and it goes against Chazal, it goes against the Baalei Masorah. And approach number three is he says it's dangerous because it could undermine the entire Torah. You could end up allegorizing Moshe and Aaron and Mitzrayim and all this other stuff. Okay, those are the three main approaches. By the way, needless to say, my style of Sunday shiur is we're exploring this together, so feel free to chime in with points and discussions. Yeah.
Did he talk about it being mice and bereshis as a defense against these problems?
He talks about that in when he's commenting on the other Mefarshim. He doesn't, curiously enough, to my memory, and I've listened to this recently a couple times also, I don't think he addresses that question of there is a Masorah of Ma'aseh Bereshis, which is not Pshuto K'mashmao, and this is part of that. But we will get into that, okay? So the one question that comes up a lot in the people in the shiur who were there is they'll say, well, what about this Mefarish and what about that Mefarish? And Rebbe will say, he says this a couple times, forget the Mefarshim. First, you got to use your seichel, okay? But then eventually he does address the fact that there are Mefarshim who talk about this. So he says, most of the Mefarshim really interpret the Nachash literally. Rav Saadia Gaon, Ibn Ezra, Rashi, the Ramban doesn't say it's allegorical. I mean, most of the Rishonim all interpret literally. The ones that have problems with it were more the Achronim. Oh, by the way, this is from later on in the shiur. This is in 1 hour and 17 minutes, which I think is at the beginning of the second shiur. The ones that have problems with it were the Achronim, the Sforno. Okay, remember Sforno? So there's certain people who, like, in my mind, they're in the Rishon club because they write and think like Rishonim, but like, timeline wise, Sforno was 1470 something to 1550. Okay, but the ones that have problems with it are more the Achronim, the Sforno. He's the main one. Then you have the Radak, sort of Hedges. He has problems with the Ibn Ezra, problems which we answered basically. He also, Rebbe mentions the Ralbag at a certain point in the shiur. Okay, so obviously, Rebbe is learned Mefarshim, okay? But what I heard when I thought this, okay, was, okay, and again, I encourage everyone to listen to the shiur. Questions that I would suggest pondering when you're listening to the shiur is, number one, are these objections sound? Okay, meaning obviously you can't just, even though it's Rebbe, you can't just take anything and just accept it. You have to think about it, right? So ask yourself, are these sound? Two, what if, this is what I kept thinking, what if there were a non-literal approach to the Nachash, which A, avoids the problem of inconsistency, B, is supported by the Baalei Masorah, and C, has parameters such that it doesn't endanger Torah, right? If those are Rebbe's objections, then what if you had, in other words, Rebbe's not objecting per se to non-literal. He's objecting to a non-literal approach because of these problems. So what if there were an approach that address these problems? Spoiler alert, that's Sforno. Okay, but it's not just Sforno. And question 3, and this is one that you really have to listen to his tone of voice also, and how he like where he ends up. To what extent does Rebbe actually reject the Mefarshim who allegorize the Nachash? Okay, it sounds at certain points as though he's rejecting them in full. Other times it sounds like he just is acknowledging the danger in such approaches, but he's not rejecting their approaches totally. Sometimes he thinks that people shouldn't teach those approaches. Okay, but he doesn't comment on the approach itself. So you really have to listen to the whole thing and form your own opinion of this. Okay, it's not as simple as my 19-year-old first listening was when I heard it. Okay. Okay, so that takes care for now of Rebbe's objections. Just any questions before we go into the Abravanel? And I'll say this many times just so no one makes an accusation otherwise. Listen to this yourself, okay? If I had the 26 minutes, we would sit here and we would play Rebbe's shiur, but that's just not how these Sunday shiurim work, okay? So, and I don't want to assign homework like I do for my high school students. Okay, so let's go to the Abravanel's objections, and we're going to read it and compare and contrast it to Rebbe's. Okay, so, my apologies, usually in my Sunday shiurim, I like to make everything in English. The Abravanel is just so long that I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate it, and that way it'll, I can skip stuff. So I'm just going to read it in English with the Hebrew on the screen. So he says, and also, for some things, the Abravanel, he's a fiery Spaniard, and the way that he says it in Hebrew is just packs such a punch that like it'd be like, destroying the poetry to say it otherwise. So he says, I'll read this first part in Hebrew. This is in his Hagdama to Perek Sheni of Bereshis. Yish me'hamafarshim pirshuhu kfi pshat haksuvim. So some explain it according to the straightforward surface meaning, however you define pshat. Uv'derech hazeh halach Rashi v'Haramban v'gam harav Avram ben Ezra. Okay, listen to what he says about this. Avram ben Ezra, hisbir panim l'derech hazeh. I don't know how you want to translate that, but he shows an external endorsement of that pshat, okay, of the pshat approach. He says things are to be accepted literally. Without a doubt, he doesn't actually think this. Okay, Ibn Ezra is misleading you. Okay. As he points out later on in his allusions. Okay, knowing Abravanel's style as he raises a bunch of questions, I think he raises 50 plus questions on this entire narrative, and he says that the pshat, you can answer most of them according to the pshat. Okay. V'derech hasheni, the second approach in the Mefarshim, that the story is not according to its straightforward meaning and did not happen, but it's entirely an allegory and an illusion that's metaphorical. Okay, so that's the Rambam. Okay, that's the secret derech of the Ibn Ezra. V'harabag, Gamkein b'pirusha l'Torah, and also the Rabag on his explanation of the Torah. Now, Abravanel was a few decades earlier than Sforno, so he never read the Sforno's stuff. Okay, but Sforno is clearly in this approach also. And all the people who follow their derech. Okay, so those are the three chief offenders. Okay, according to this, is Rambam, Ibn Ezra, and Rabag. And he says, they have differences in how they interpret the metaphor. But he says what the common denominator is that the entire parsha, or most of it, is according to an allegorical reading. Okay, now pause. Does Rebbe hold that Rambam and Ibn Ezra and Rabag take this metaphorically? Okay, so I thought not, because he says, and this one, again, you have to hear his tone of voice. He says, and one of the Gedolei HaMefarshim, one who is really considered someone who's not bound by this is the way they consider them. I don't consider them this way, but the outside world considers them this way, is an individual who's not bound by the so-called traditional interpretation, methods of interpretation, which to their mind makes them a kind of free-range thinker. Again, I don't agree with this. I think it's because they don't understand him. This individual, namely the Ibn Ezra, is the one who says the Nachash is Pshuto Shal Mikra. So this is immediately should set you off that there's something funny over here. And Rebbe presents his shiur as though he is giving an elucidation of the Ibn Ezra. Because Ibn Ezra, let's see what the Ibn Ezra, did I put this here? No. So in the shiur, Rebbe makes it sound like the Ibn Ezra definitely holds that the Nachash is literal, okay? Later on in the shiur, he does say Ibn Ezra says that the Nachash was a sod, or a secret. I couldn't hear the exact word, but it's clear that's what he means. I know there's a Rambam on this, and everyone goes to the Rambam in the Moreh with Samael riding on the Nachash. Again, over here, I would like to mention something which I think is important also. Two things. First of all, if anyone understands the secrets of the Moreh Nevuchim, I would suggest they shouldn't disclose them, because that's exactly why the Rambam wrote them as a secret, okay? That's the secrets of the Moreh, that the secrets of the Moreh Nevuchim are supposed to remain secrets. I mean, that's how the Rambam paskin that shaila, and I think he certainly is one that has the right to paskin a shaila on his own works, okay? That's number one. Okay, now, I'll hold off my comments till the number two. Number two, I think it really is foolish for a person to think when he reads the Moreh Nevuchim that he's going to understand the secrets of the Rambam because of something that the Rambam himself said. The Rambam said about the Ibn Ezra. He said, and I don't know where the statement is. If anyone can find it, let me know. He said the Ibn Ezra's sodos cannot be understood by anyone other than he who is within his madrega, on his madrega, his level. They cannot be understood by anyone who is not on the madrega of the Ibn Ezra. Doesn't mean he has to be as great as the Ibn Ezra, but he's got to be like, we have a lashon of the Chachmei Yisrael. You have to be in his mechitza, in his like realm. There's such a thing as mechitzos, boundaries. I don't think anyone today thinks that they're in the mechitza of the Rambam. So therefore, it's futile for a person to think that he's going to understand the secrets of the Moreh by studying the Moreh. That's an impossibility. Now, this is what I meant when I said it's hard to tell what Rebbe thinks, meaning he clearly thinks that you shouldn't disclose the secrets of the Moreh, and that if you think you understand them, then you should question yourself. But if you said to Rebbe, do you hold that the Rambam held that this was allegorical? I don't think he addresses that in this shiur, okay? The Abravanel clearly holds that the Rambam held that it was allegorical, okay? And many others on the Rambam hold that. I mean, I think that is the Rove Shita from what I've seen. Everyone who I've seen talk about the Rambam's approach to Gan Eden, seems to say that he holds it's allegorical, okay? So, but that's the question. Now, I want to show you inside the Ibn Ezra, just so you can see where Rebbe's getting this from. So Ibn Ezra on Breshis Gimel Aleph says, V'hanachash. So he summarizes, he says, Yesh omrim, ki ha'isha haisa mevina v'yodas lashon chayos. So some say that the woman understood and knew the language of the animals. Obviously, the big question is talking snake. I feel like I didn't have to say that, right? Okay, so some say that the woman understood the language of the animals. And v'farshu v'yomer hanachash b'remizos. And they say that when the serpent spoke, it meant that it spoke through signs. Okay, now we're not going to go into the Abravanel's actual interpretation of the Gan Eden story, but he holds this. He holds that the Nachash was doing actions, okay, in the same way as, for example, like a dog who wants to be let out can like paw on the door and like whimper in a certain way, and it's not like it's speaking intelligibly, but you know what it's conveying. The Abravanel holds that that's what the Nachash was doing and that Chava understood it, but it wasn't speaking verbally. Now, do you want to call that non-literal or literal? That's another question. What does Rebbe mean by literal or non-literal? Totally besides allegorizing it in whole. Okay, then Ibn Ezra says, the Achirim Omrim, some say Shehu Satan, that the Nachash was the Satan. Of Eich lo yiru sofa parsha. How could they not see the end of the parsha? Eich yelech Satan al gachon, veich yelcho afar. How can the Satan walk on its belly and eat dust? Okay, that's a problem with that pirush. Okay, now obviously, what are the people who hold that it's allegorical going to say? That also is allegorical. And if you listen to Rabbi Shiur, seems like he holds that that's allegorical. Okay, so you got to listen to the shiur. Uma tam l'kalam hu yishuvcha rosh, and why l'kilas hu yishuvcha rosh? Why would God curse the snake? Right, the snake didn't have bechira, it never got its tzivui, so why does it get punished? Okay, so these are all questions which Rebbe does address in the shiur, and presents a full picture according to this these questions. V'rabim hishtabshu lachor lama kilo hanachash im haisalo da shlema. This is what I meant to say. O tziva shlo yasi ha'isha. So many inquire, why was the serpent cursed? They ask, why was the serpent fully intelligent? Was he commanded by God to refrain from tricking the woman? Okay, V'yomer Rav Sadigon, achar shnis bar lan she'ein. I'll just read in English. Rav Sadigon says, since we know that only humans are intelligent and capable of speaking, we must conclude that neither the serpent nor Bilam's donkey spoke. He argues that in reality, an angel spoke for them. However, Rabbi Shmuel ben Chofni took issue with him. On the other hand, Shlomo ibn Gabirol, the great Spanish scholar and poet who wrote and metered verse, arose and disagreed with Shmuel ben Chofni. Okay, so that's the end of the Ibn Ezra's, no, not yet. Sorry, most important point. What makes sense to me, shadvarim kamashman, is things are according to their plain implication. V'hanachash hayamadaber, the snake spoke. V'hu holich b'kamuzakufa, it walked upright. V'hashem v'hasam das ba'adam sambo, the one who implanted man with knowledge implanted knowledge in the snake. And this is what Rebbe is giving shiur on. Okay, now. Rebbe said that he was aware that there are those who say that Ibn Ezra had a sod. Now, I don't know when Rebbe gave the Chumash here, and I don't know what Ibn Ezra commentaries were available then, but just FYI, I think most people are aware Ibn Ezra wrote two commentaries on Shemos. They call it the long commentary and the short commentary. I don't know how many people are aware that Ibn Ezra wrote a commentary on Bereshis and then started to write a new commentary on Bereshis. You'll find it in the Torah Chaim at the end, and it's called the Shita Acheres. And I think it only goes up through the first, like, definitely not past 20 chapters. I think maybe like the first, dozen or something. I asked someone once, an Ibn Ezra expert, what's that about? Why he write it? And they said that he was in a situation where his life was in danger, and he made a vow to Hashem that if he got out of it, he would write another commentary. And so he started writing it, but he didn't finish. So that's the later commentary. Now, in the later commentary, and again, I don't know if Rebbe was referring to this or if Abravanel was referring to this, but here's what he says in the second commentary on Bereshis Gimel Chav Aleph. Sod Hagan v'hanaharos v'kosnos. I will reveal to you the secret of the garden and the rivers and the garments. I didn't find any of the Gedolim talking about this sod. Only Shlomo ibn Gabirol said this, and then he goes on and he explains what the Nachash is a metaphor for and what the garments are a metaphor for, and he goes through the whole thing allegorically. Okay, so again, in Rebbe Shir, he talks about the Ibn Ezra as though we should get like a Musar Haskel from the fact that the Ibn Ezra took it literally. But then the Ibn Ezra himself says it was a sod, and Abravanel says, yeah, he wants you to think that he's taking it literally, but he's not taking it literally. And Rebbe seems to acknowledge that. That's why you got to listen to Rebbe Shir. Okay. All right. Yes. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So sorry, we already moved here, right? So now we're going to go through the Abravanel's objections to allegorizing the Nachash. And as we read through these, think to yourself how they compare with Rebbe's arguments. Okay, and I'll help here. So he says, I'm just going to read this in English. Yes, tomorrow.
About the Ibn Ezra,
yeah,
if he has a commentary where he says it's Pshat, and then he also has a sod, do you take that to mean that the Pshat is like not what he really meant and it was a cover? Like, I mean, everyone else taking it that way, but wouldn't you think that it means that there's also an idea to learn from this, and it also happened?
It's a good question. So the Abravanel's take on Gan Eden, which he ultimately concludes with, which we're not going to go into, is he says the whole story should be understood as literal, as though it happened, but you can also read it allegorically. Okay, so that's what you're suggesting. Maybe the Ibn Ezra means that the fact that he says it's Pshat means that he does hold that there's truth in the Pshat, but then you can also read it allegorically. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that is definitely like plausible. I've seen, maybe I'm just biased from the Abravanel because this is not the only time he says this about the Ibn Ezra, that Ibn Ezra is like playing like hide and seek here with his secrets. And Ibn Ezra is well known for having secrets. So I don't know enough about the derech of his esoteric teachings to know how to grapple with a contradiction like that. So I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So here's what the Abravanel says. So he says, if you take the Nachash literally, there are tremendous problems. Okay, Sveikos Gedolos. One problem is, he says, if everything that was written from the beginning of the Torah until here, from the first creation account, is a true account, according to the Pshat, and then after this Parsha, all of the words of the Sefer are true accounts, according to their Pshat, how is it possible for there to be inserted in the middle a huge Parsha like this that doesn't have any actual account and the Pshat is not true, but is philosophical or natural or metaphysical chachma, right? Because that's what Ibn Ezra and Ralbag and Rambam allegedly say, which is that the Gan Eden is like this separate parsha, which is all allegory that is teaching esoteric ideas. Okay, he says, and what is the connection, if so, between what came before it and what comes after it? If we say that this parsha is on the level of something like Eov, which Moshe Rabbeinu wrote from his own Chakira. So Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu is the author of Eov, and that the final shita in the Gemara in Bava Basra about Eov is that lo hayav lo nivra, that it never happened and the whole thing's an allegory. So he says, if this is so, then why would Moshe write this book in the other accounts of the Torah? He should make it a separate book like Eov. Okay, so Abravanel's objection number one is such an approach is inconsistent, meaning, why are you reading the entire rest of the Torah as though it's Pshuto Kamashmao, and then this one story you're saying is not? Okay. He goes on. Objection number two. He says, among the objections is, if we permit you to make an allegory of this component of Ma'aseh Bereshis and to take the Psukim out of their literal meaning and to be drawn after the rational meaning, meaning like a intellectual, allegorization. Who will prevent this from being done with? Who will prevent us from making an allegory out of the 6 days? And to say that maybe they're not like their literal meaning, and that Maaseh Bereshis is also that might be a typo in the edition. These things are Maaseh Bereshis. In other words, you might now take Maaseh Bereshis allegorically and say that we don't actually believe in literally that God created the world, and that's bad. I'll call you a second. What's the Rambam going to do when he has to give his account and reckoning before God? Who permitted the Rambam to make an allegory out of some Maaseh Bereshis and some not? Or if he thinks that you should do it out of everything. Okay, that's why I wanted to show the Hebrew. It's good. Yeah, Arya?
By not literally the first is because
yeah,
the Ramban doesn't. I mean, he says things that make it not literal.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So this is a whole other problem, which is what do we make of the first 6 days? Okay, and when the Mefarshim say, none of the Mefarshim, I don't think, hold that you just read the first 6 days and just take it absolutely literally, the lashon sets itself up that God called the or yom and the choshech kara layla. Like the psukim instruct you in that there are terms here that are not literal, But it does seem that the vast majority, if not, I think all of the Mefarshim I've seen, do take the 6 days as describing a reality that occurred in the physical world, even if they're using figurative language, But it's describing in other words, like this. Let's take the Ralbag, okay? Ralbag learns Gan Eden as a mashal, that Adam is in the Gan Eden account, is a mashal for the seichel, and the isha is a mashal for the chomer, and and etc. So he's saying that the activities that happen in Gan Eden and the events didn't actually happen. But with the 6 days of creation, he's saying that it did happen, but maybe it's being told in an oversimplified way, or maybe it's being told in figurative language. For example, in the same way as in Parshas Noach, when we say that the windows of heaven were opened, that is not describing, that is describing a factual occurrence, but we don't hold that there are literal windows up there. We're using figurative language to describe a physical reality. So too here, I think the Abravanel means that we certainly hold that the 6 days of creation are describing a physical reality, even if it's using figurative language. But these Mefarshim seem to be learning elements of Gan Eden as though it's not describing any physical reality at all. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
On the first objection that you have,
yeah,
says that how can you take this piece and say that it's allegorical, and then the rest of the Torah say it's not. I guess there's one the piece and then two the allegory. Does he mean to say that you can't just take pieces or partials of the Torah and say that this is not literal? Because it seems like there are definitely things later on in the Torah that we wouldn't say are literal. Right. God can. Right. That we wouldn't have a problem with.
Okay. So let me, I meant to ask you to remind me to do this. I have this bad habit of not repeating the question into the mic. Okay. So the question that's being asked here is when in the Abravanel's first objection, when he says that it's inconsistent, how can you take some parts literally and other parts not? Chaim is saying, there are other parts in the Torah that we take words or phrases not literally. So the clear example, which Rebbe addresses in his shiur, is what about all the anthropomorphisms about God, right? No one has a problem with saying that Yad Hashem is not literal. So I think my understanding of the Abravanel's approach is in terms of a section of the Torah, that we don't say that there's any section of the Torah where it has a whole narrative or a whole chapter or a whole thing where that whole thing is not literal. Now, that does not fully address taking just the Nachash as allegorical. So it's possible, it seems like he's also objecting to saying that a full character, for example, did not actually exist physically, even though it's depicted as interacting with these things.
I suppose also you could also answer by saying that there are certain things that are impossible to take literally.
Right.
There are certain things that are impossible, they just don't seem very likely.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, everyone holds that there are parts of the Torah that we don't take literally because of the impossibility, yeah. Okay, so second objection is...
yes. Anyways?
Yeah.
What's the problem with taking it literal?
So the problem with taking it literal, Ibn Ezra alluded to some of it. I mean, the basic problem is a talking snake. And if you're going to say, well, God made Bilam's donkey talk, well, there it says God opened the mouth of the donkey. It doesn't say that here. Why did God punish the snake? If it was never instructed otherwise. Those I think are the main problems. Yeah. And again, it's not like a horrendous problem. It's just like, it's funny to talk about a talking snake. Like, you would assume that that's not literal. Here, the Abravanel is saying that this approach is dangerous because it can undermine the Yesodei HaTorah. Specifically, I'm saying the Yesodei HaTorah, but specifically the Emunas HaChidush is belief in the creation of the world. That's what he talks about. But you'll see from the implication in the next objection that he would extend this elsewhere. Okay, third and final objection. He says another problem is if we untie the knot or the strap and make an allegory of psukim and take them out of their pshat, this will necessitate k'tzitza b'netioseha, uprooting the shoots of the Torah. Kitis pashit hatsaras. This saras of this approach will spread. See, this is why I like the Hebrew here. V'tavo gamkin lasasura v'chikuim b'mitzvos haTorah chukoseh u'mishpatah. Then you'll come to make allegories of the mitzvos of the Torah and its chukim and mishpatim. Im haya muter b'ktsasa, huter b'kula. If you're going to permit it here, you're going to permit it everywhere. So that's a similar objection, which is this approach is dangerous because it can undermine mitzvos. Okay, so those are the Abravanel's three objections. Okay, and before we compare him to Rebbe, I just want to read this part. This is very interesting to me. He says, I think that these problems were sensed by Harav Chassid the Ran, okay, the Drushas Ran, and that caused him to refrain from explaining this parsha. Okay, he says, Ki lo atar koach neged bnei amo lefarsho al tzad hatzura, ukfi pshuta lo yachola. He says he knew he doesn't want to explain it allegorically because of the reluctance, because of these things, but he also knows you can't explain it according to the Pshat. And so he said in his heart, Eshmra lefid machsom, I'm going to just muzzle myself, okay? Which, by the way, is what Rebbe said you should do, is just say, I don't know, right? So he's saying that that's what the Ran was thinking. And he says, and therefore, when he explained in the commentary that he began to make on the Torah, I don't know if that's referring to in the Drushos Ran or if the Ran wrote a separate beginning of the commentary. He skips these explaining this until Todos Hashemayim, Ela Todos Hashemayim, V'Haaretz Bad V'Adam Yad Aschava Ishto, Ki Pad Pen Yishachenu Nachash B'li Lachash. He's afraid that he's going to get bit by a snake that wasn't charmed. Okay. Okay, so therefore he didn't explain anything. A very interesting approach. And then he says, and Ramban did something similar. He says, because although he did not refrain absolutely from explaining this parsha, he says he hid his face with regards to the majority of these psukim and didn't explain. And he says, I'm not going to do this. I can't refrain from expressing my opinion. Okay? So he gives a full treatment of the parsha. Okay, so compare Rebbe's objections and the Abravanel's objections. So you'll see, again, going with my color code, approach number one seems to be pretty much the same, right? Is that it's inconsistent. How can you make an allegory out of this and not elsewhere? And then Rebbe's approach of this undermines the Torah, or his objection of this undermines the Torah, the Abravanel voices as two objections, that you're undermining the yesod of Emunas HaChidush and you're undermining mitzvos. And Rebbe didn't talk about mitzvos, but you could assume that Rebbe would acknowledge that there's a danger in doing that also, like, if you're going to allegorize Torah, okay? So the question that I have is, what about Rebbe's objection number two, that this goes against the Baalei Masorah? Now, from the way that the Abravanel has been talking, okay, how would you compare and contrast the Abravanel's presentation with Rebbe's presentation regarding this point about the Masorah? I know it's a very vague or a very leading question here. In other words, Rebbe presents this as you're throwing away all the Baalei Masorah and you're going against Chazal, but you don't get that vibe from the Abravanel. Okay, in fact, what did the Abravanel do? So Rebbe presents the approach as going against the derech of the Baalei Masorah. The Abravanel presents it as a derech of the Baalei Masorah, which he disagrees with. Okay, and I think that's a very significant thing. He started off by saying there are two drachim in the Mefarshim, and he says the derech of the Rashi and Ramban, and he says, and there's the derech of the Rambam, the Ralbag, and the real Ibn Ezra, right? So a question I have, which I'm not going to answer fully here, but I think this is another question you should have in mind when you listen to the shiur, Rebbe's shiur. Is this machlokas between Rebbe and the Abravanel merely pedagogical? And I don't mean to say merely in the sense that it's unimportant, or do they really disagree? In other words, if you ask Rebbe, was the Rambam throwing away the approach of the Bali Masorah? Was the Ibn Ezra, was the Rabag? Are the Rambam, Ibn Ezra, and Rabag not part of the Masorah? I don't think Rebbe would say yes, right? So it's possible Rebbe is emphasizing this because either he holds that it's not the rove of the Mefarshim, or he holds that you could take this in a way that is going against the Masorah, or the people who take this approach tend to throw away the Masorah. Okay, again, he talks about this in the shiur a lot. So Rebbe is choosing to present this as an anti-Masorah approach, whereas Bravanel is choosing to present this as an approach within the Masorah that he finds problems with and disagrees with. And I just want to note, those are two different presentations. And is this just a difference in presentation, or is this a substantive difference? Okay, was there a question, Yaakov?
Which volume? Sorry.
Is Rebbe talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, he says all of Chazal, and he says the Rishonim, Rov Rishonim don't take this approach. And he said, and again, Rebbe also says Achronim do take this approach, right? So like, again, I think it'd be very extreme to say that Rebbe is saying that Sforno was not part of the Masorah, and but question is, why is Rebbe wording it so strongly? Okay, so that you can think about when you listen to Rebbe shiur. Okay, so that takes us to the end of Abravanel's objections to allegorizing the Nachash. Any questions before we go to his defense? Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to read. He defends the Rambam, and this is something that the Abravanel has done many times, is he will, especially with the Rambam, is he will create a very, very sound defense of the Rambam, and then say, but I have a completely different approach, okay? Because and he's not the only one. Ritva wrote the whole Sefer Hazikaron is what it's called, right? To defend the Rambam against the attacks of the Ramban, even though the Ritva didn't agree with the Rambam, okay? So that's what we're going to go through next. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, first thing I want to do is to be Malamed Zuchus on the Rav, on the Rambam, and those who cling to his path in explaining this parsha in an allegorical and metaphorical manner. So he says, behold, in the mitzvos of the Torah and the chukim nishpatim, they never were so brazen, and it never occurred to them to take the psukim out of their literal meaning, chalila. Okay, so that's number one. None of the mefarshim take the mitzvos non-literally. Okay, he says because everything that has ma'aseh kimu v'kiblu aleihem v'alzarim lishmor v'lasos is that they accepted upon themselves to do, to keep and to do. Same thing with the account of the creation in the 6 days. The Rambam did not make it a perush. I mean, he didn't take it allegorically, and he didn't deviate from the pshat of the psukim that are testified about the Torah in terms of the emunus chidush ha'olam, the belief in the creation of the world that is accepted by the nation. But in the accounts of the trees of the Gan and the creation of the woman from man's tzelah and the words of the Nachash, he did fill his heart to take them out of their pshat, either because of svara. I mean, not either. Both because of svara, of rational svara hasichlis, v'imi pas heros me'aros divrei Chazal k'mo shevar, and because he saw that Chazal did this. Okay, so step one, he's saying Rambam, I'm just going to call this Rambam et al., meaning Rambam and all those who took his path, did not advocate allegorizing the mitzvos, nor did they allegorize chidush ha'olam, the creation. His allegorization was limited to specific elements of the text. Okay, and two, he was motivated by rationality and Masorah. Now, again, here we're seeing a difference, between, and again, if anyone knows of a shiur where Rebbe does take up the Rambam in the Morah, which sounds like he wouldn't give such a shiur because on the secrets of the Morah, but like here is pedagogically what Rebbe and the Abravanel are doing is very different. Rebbe was presenting this as going against the Masorah, and the Abravanel is trying to show how this is in line with the Masorah. And just as a side point, just to be Malamed Zuchus on the Rabag, okay, Rabag in many ways is the most radical of the Rishonim in certain areas. For example, in his denial of Chidush Ha'olam Yesh Me'ayin, right? But even the Rabag, when he writes about denying the creation Yesh Me'ayin, Rabag holds that the universe was created from a pre-existing primordial matter that existed eternally. Okay, like they say that that's like Plato's view. I don't know if it's the same view, but similar to that. But when he does it, when the Rabag does it, he does not say that he's going against the Masorah. He says that this is really what Chazal held, and that it was the other Mefarshim who came afterwards that got it wrong. Okay, so even no matter what you say about the truth of their views, they're not trying to present this as against the Masorah thing. They're trying to show that this is from the Masorah. Okay, so then he says like this. The Rav explained at the end of Chelik Beis, chapter 29, and in chapter 30 after it, that what he brought in his two prefaces when he says that not everything in Maaseh Bereshis is according to the Pshat. Okay, and then the Abravanel quotes it, but he has a lot of v'chules, so I'm just going to quote directly from the Moreh. By the way, side point, I got asked on, I got actually asked two questions. One question was on Friday night, someone asked me, who's relatively new to the yeshiva community, he said, everyone in yeshiva has the Moreh on the shelf. Does everyone learn it? And I said, probably not, but also, if you ask Rebbe, I mean, we used to ask Rebbe this all the time, like, in new yeshiva guys, should we learn the Moreh? And he would say no, right? And yet, everyone quotes the Moreh, right? So the approach that I took, and I'm not saying that this is endorsed by Rebbe, but the approach I took for myself in my relationship with the Moreh is anytime one of my Rebbeim in yeshiva quotes the Moreh, or anytime I saw one of the Mefarshim quote it, like the Mefarshim who we learn, I would look it up inside. Okay, and that's not the same thing as being kovea to like learn the more Nebuchim, saying like on level, but I want to understand what my Rebbeim are saying from the sources, and I want to understand what the Mefarshim, like if the Ramban's going to quote the Moreh in his commentary, presumably he holds that this is something that can be talked about, So I'm quoting this in that spirit. Now I'm going to use the Makbili Hebrew, which is the currently my favorite Hebrew one, and then the new Goodman translation of the English. This is in the end of the Moreh 229. He says, now that the discussion has reached this point, I will have a chapter for you highlighting some points in our text relevant to the account of the creation. For my chief aim in this work was just to clarify, so far as I can, the account of creation and the account of the chariot, Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava. But I have two general provisos to make in advance. First, not everything regarding creation in the Torah can be taken at face value as the masses imagine. Otherwise, why would scholars balk at the topic and the sages press the need to keep it under wraps and not expound it publicly? So in plain English, what that means is clearly we don't approach Maaseh Bereshis like the Christian literalists, where they just take it like, exactly literally. Because if that were the case, how could Chazal talk about this esoteric body of knowledge called Maaseh Bereshis, which they have all these halachos about keeping secret? Right? If you could get the secrets of Maaseh Bereshis by reading the psukim that we read in shul, then clearly, like, it would be impossible to keep it secret. So the fact that they're talking about keeping the real meaning secret means that there is a real meaning, which is not pshuto k'mashmao. Okay, so that's his first point. I don't think anyone disagrees with this. Taken literally, as a second objection, taken literally, these texts lead either to gross delusions rife with misconceptions about God, or to sheer unbelief and denial of core tenets of religion. It is unwise to explore these questions armed only with imagination rather than scientific knowledge. Now, I don't know which things he's talking about exactly, but for example, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, God does not speak with a larynx, right? Or Nas Adam B'Tomenu K'Nusenu, let us make man in our likeness, not like our image. God is not multiple and he doesn't have an image, right? So I don't know if he means taking it literally like that or if he's talking about other things, but clearly you can't take Maaseh Bereshis totally literally. And then he says, best to avoid what wretched homilists and exegetes do, the darshanim and mafarshim, who think knowing how to gloss a phrase is all the science they need, and that the windier, I don't know if it's windier or windier, okay, whatever, and wordier their treatments run, the better. The reason is what we need to probe this subject, a mind honed by the rigorous sciences and at home with the secrets of the prophet. So in other words, you need to approach this, you can't just use the text. I mean, even if you're not just taking it Pshat wise, but in other words, there's one problem of just taking it simply literally, but then there's another problem of thinking you can get everything you can from the text. I mean, I'll always remember this, that in my first year in yeshiva, my second year of yeshiva, there was a chavrusa that they sat down and they had a chavrusa in trying to work out Maaseh Bereshis just from the psukim without any mafarshim. I was like, good luck with that. He's saying you can't do that. You need two things. You need science and you need the sodos of the Nevi'im. Okay. And he says, as I explained more than once in my commentary on the Mishnah, one who does not know something of this should not broadcast it. Sorry, one who does know something of this should not broadcast it, as they say. Now, this is the part that the Abravanel quotes. I forgot to highlight this. Mitchilas hasefer v'ad kan kavod elokim haster davar. From the beginning of the book until here, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. And then, I didn't realize he doesn't quote the second half of that. Anyone know the rest of the pasuk? It says chakor davar, something that is investigate the thing. Yeah, if someone could get the pasuk, that'd be good. He says they said this at the end of the sixth day. Okay, up to the end of the sixth day. And he says, you'll see what I mean. Now, the Rambam is going to explain this. Okay, Rambam was just saying, just note that there's a statement of Chazal that says from the beginning of the book until here, it is the glory of God to keep a secret. Okay, which is talking about the sixth day, okay? And then he says, yet God's command does oblige one who has gained some measure of enlightenment to share it, as I will explain in later chapters about prophecy. Whoever wins some knowledge of these mysteries by personal inquiry or with the help from a guide, little shameless self-promotion there, must say something, only not too openly. He must only offer glimpses. There are many such things, many such hints and intimations in the words of some of our sages, but they are mingled with other remarks and the words of other speakers. That is why you will notice that in addressing these mysteries, I always cite only the key remark and leave the rest of those best prepared for it. Okay, so if you look at these chapters in the Moreh, Rambam, all he does is basically just cites Chazals on Gan Eden and Ma'aseh Bereshis and just says a few words. That's it. He's like hinting. Okay, then this is the other part that the Abravanel quotes in the next chapter in the Moreh. He says another thing to consider closely when it speaks of man's creation in the 6 days of creation. It says Zachar nekeva bara osam, male and female, he created them, and it concludes the account of creation with heaven and earth and all their hosts were complete. Okay, that's the end of Perek Aleph, or beginning of Perek Beis. Then it recaps, starting afresh to relate how Eve was made from Adam and the telling of the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, the tale of the serpent, and that whole narrative, setting all these events after Adam's placement in Gan Eden. So this is a well-known thing that there's 2 creation accounts from Aleph Aleph through Beis Daled, and then from Beis Hey through questions where that ends. Okay, all this was on Friday, on Yom HaShishi, and no change was made after the 6 days of creation, as all the sages agree. So nothing earlier should seem incredible. For as I said, until then, the nature of things was not yet set. They said other things that I can tell you, gleaned in various places, alerting as to points I'll share with you. These points that I'll cite from the sages' discussions, as you see, are perfect as can be and crystal clear to those addressed. So I will not expatiate or elaborate in glossing them to avoid exposing secrets. Outlines lightly sketched in gentle hints will suffice for someone like you. Now, I read through this quickly because I want to read what the Abravanel says in his summary of this. He says, behold, you see with your eyes from these statements that he quoted from the Rambam, that the das of the Rambam was not that the entire Ma'aseh Bereshis is a mashal, but only part of it. And that everything that was mentioned in the 6 days from the creation of Shemayim V'aretz and all of the existences and the creation of man and his wife until the end of the parsha of Vaychulu, there's no mashal at all. Everything is according to the Pshat. Okay, now again, you have to assess on your own whether the Rambam actually thinks that everything from the beginning of day 1 until then is Pshat, but this is what the Abravanel thinks. He's saying from Aleph Aleph through Beis Daled is not allegorical. And he says, therefore, you'll see that in Perek Lamed Chelik Beis, everything that the Rambam explains in the Malacha of the 6 days, he did not make an allegorical or metaphorical interpretation at all, but he did the opposite. He said he strove with a great or skillful striving to uphold the belief in the creation of the world definitively and to accept the psukim according to the Pshat. Okay, so Rambam definitely holds by Chiddush Olam. I know that there are academic conspiracy theorists who dispute that, but that's what he goes the way that we learn the Rambam also. Okay, now the Rambam does. Oh, sorry. Did I copy this twice? I think I copied this. Oh no, I'm pressing backwards. That's why it's going. Okay. Okay. However, the topic of the trees and the Nachash and the creation of the woman from the Tzela, that's where the Rambam thought that it's not like Pshat. Okay. And what brought him to this first was the difficulty of these things in themselves and their impossibility, as I pointed out in questions 13, 14, 15, 25, 26, 27, 28, 34, 35, 36, okay, that they indicate the impossibility of the things that the psukim, they indicate the impossibility of taking the psukim according to the Pshat. So Michael Goldberg was asking, what's the problem with the Nachash? Taking that according to Pshat, you'll find it probably in one of these questions they brought now. Okay, it says, the divine Torah would never bequeath to us false ideas or belief in impossible things, God forbid. And therefore, it was proper for him to explain these psukim in a way that is in line with rationality and not a way that's invalid and impossible. You'll also find the Rambam indicate so the Rambam also has a tremendous proof that from Shabiyom HaShishi, I have to read this in Hebrew. On the 6th day, Nizkar Brias Adam Ishto, it describes the creation of man and his wife. Shnemar Zachar Nekeva Bar Osam. Umash Davar Shadiber Vitziva Hashem Lahem Umash Emana Lama'achalam. So it talks about what God spoke to them and commanded them and what he prepared for their food. And it completes the story with Vaithulu. And therefore, everything that's mentioned afterwards in the second creation account, which is Hekfel Mavur, an overt repetition, the Inchil of Gadol, but with huge differences, but often Yitziras Ha'isha, in the creation of the woman, Hayaroi mipnei hayitur v'hahekvel v'hashinui hazeh im zaros hapshat himano shiforshu advarim hahem be'oven acher. So in other words, the Rambam saw that since the story repeats itself and there are huge differences and there are strange things in the second account that are impossible, that's what led the Rambam to interpret it metaphorically. Mina chachma, with rationality. So that it doesn't go against rationality. V'lo mosar al mash nizkar b'yom hashvi'i. And that it's not a repetition. Okay, so he's going to summarize. He says, and the Rav was supported. Where did I go? The Rav was supported by this from the words of Chazal when they said in Bereshis Rabbah that from Vaychul Hashmayim, from the beginning of the book to Vaychul Hashmayim, Ad kan kvod elokim haster davar, mikan ve'elach kvod elokim chakor davar. That's the second half of the pasuk. From here and on, it is the glory of God to analyze a thing. So what does that mean? Everything in the 6 days of creation in the first account of Bereshis, you should not take it allegorically. You should take it according to the Pshat, even though you don't know the depth of it. That's what it means by it's concealed. In other words, first 6 days you take literally, but it's very deep. So it's concealed, and the glory of God is in that concealment, meaning it's so deep that it's going to bring glory to God when you decode it. But from here and on, the second creation account, and the idea of the Atzei Hagan, the trees of the garden, and the Nachash, they're included in analyze a thing. Okay, because there is an internal meaning, and there is no sin at all in analyzing what they stand for, and therefore Amar Harav shepasach hakasub ze Pesach achar b'yitzir shenis hu asher chashav lachos mashal, and that's what the Rambam used to make it a mashal. Okay, and he says, okay, hold on a second here. Okay, I'm almost at the summary. Sorry, this is why this is long. He says, and he also mentions in his proofs of the creation of Chava from Adam and the ideas of the trees and the Nachash. He says, you'll see that the Rambam did not make the Gan or the rivers a mashal like Ibn Ezra did, or the Rabag, because he thought that that is according to the Pshat in these other things. Okay, and Rambam was also motivated by the words of Chazal, who said that all of this happened on the 6th day, which indicates that their opinion was that Shelo nase before ki lo yitachin. He says it's not possible that on the 6th day man was created, placed in Gan Eden, he slept, was anesthetized, and his side was taken from him, and the woman was built, and she brought the fruit to him, and he sinned, and she became pregnant, and she became pregnant, and they were punished and kicked out of Gan Eden. He says all of this bli safek iyafshar shaya b'yom echad. It's impossible that happened all in one day. Ela shaya kol zeh davar muskal machshavi. That's all a rational mashal. Okay. And he said, we're almost at the summary. Oh, sorry, it's so long. The upside and downside of the Rabbanel, right? Is like it's very long, but he has a lot of good stuff. The Rambam's opinion is strengthened even more after the Yom Hashishi, because it says nothing else was created, and everything continued on as it was, and therefore the stuff on the 6th day, so in other words, that little narrow window there of what the second creation account is describing is for a mashal. And he says, and to prove this even more, that Chazal held this way, and it's not like the Pshat, the Rambam says that the Chachamim, Chazal wrote things which I will collect and I'll tell you about. And in other words, the Rambam is saying that Chazal also held this way, which is why he's presenting this to you. Okay, and he says that, he quotes all the examples. I'm not going to go through that. Okay, here's the summary. If so, and it's the last part of the Rabbanel, if so, there's no necessity to say that that we should explain these psukim in a way of allegory outside of the Pshat. Sorry. Lo yischayev l'rav mi pirish hapsukim ha'ela al derech hatzura v'mizuos pshotam stir b'pinos haTorah. So the Rambam's allegorical explanation of these psukim does not pose a contradiction to the fundamentals of Torah. Lo lasos tzurus v'chakuim b'mitzvoseh. It does not warrant that he makes allegories out of the laws of the Torah of Logam came b'melech sheshes yamim, or to take the 6 days of creation allegorically of hayamim b'ma'aser bereshis ki yichud lepirush hatzuri v'hamshali b'parsha azos lebilbad mipnei shlosha sasibos shazakarti Russell Omar. Rambam only took these things non-literally for 3 reasons. One, heos pshat davar zar v'lo yispelu haseichel ukiluhu b'gvul hanimnaos, that the pshat is strange and does not tolerate rationality, and it's almost impossible. 2, the horaos haksuvim behekfil sipur yitziras adam v'ishto, the repetition of the psukim in telling the account of the creation of Adam and his wife. And 3, aros divrei chachmeinu zal, is chazal. Okay, so Rambam, according to Rabbanel, says what compelled Rambam to take this not literally. Literal reading is very strange and it's almost impossible. 2, the Torah repeats the account of man's creation. And 3, Chazal saw that these psukim were not meant to be taken literally, and Rambam was following their lead. Okay, that is the defense of the Rambam. Okay, so the question is, what would Rebbe say about that defense? Not just for the Rambam, but about anyone who takes this approach, right? So what would he say? Now, this is just speculation, and if someone wants to ask Rebbe, that would be great, but we all know that there are people who are terrible at asking Rebbe questions, right? Like the type of person who on the way out when Rebbe's leaving shul will say, Rebbe, what's the meaning of life? Can you tell me now? And then Rebbe will say a sentence, and then they'll say, yeah, Rebbe told me that blah, blah, blah. You can't talk to Rebbe like that about this. So if anyone wants to have an in-depth conversation with him about the Abravanel, that'd be great. But just logical possibilities. It's possible that the Rebbe holds that the Abravanel's assessment of these allegorical interpretations is wrong. Meaning, maybe Rebbe just disagrees with the statement that Ibn Ezra takes this metaphorically and the Rambam takes it metaphorically. Maybe Rebbe holds that Abravanel's assessment of them is accurate, but the interpretations themselves are wrong. Or maybe he holds that Abravanel's assessment of them is accurate and the approach is valid, but the derech of allegorization is so dangerous and misguided that's why Rebbe spoke out harshly against it and gave a pshuta kamashmao shiur to show the validity of the Rov Harishon. Because I'm sure Rebbe is aware that in this yeshiva, people like being rational. And it is very easy for people to just open up the Ma'aser Bereshis and say, well, the Nachash is allegorical. And there are times in that shiur where Rebbe does say, he makes it sound like the real problem is not taking it allegorically, it's taking it allegorically at like the drop of a hat. Like just, I got a problem, I'm just going to fire off the allegory gun, because then that's going to lead to taking everything allegorically, So sorry on that. Okay, now that brings us to the end of the first part of the shiur methodology. Second part is not as long, and it's a completely different shiur on how Sforno learns Adam and Chava. So if there's any, how he learns the tzelem elohim. So if there's any questions on this part, now's the time. Yeah, Esti? Yeah.
Things could change. So why does this account not fall under
I thought about that question and I don't know the answer to that question. I don't fully understand where there's this question of when the window of Ma'aser Bereshis closes, and when the window of interpreting the psukim not literally closes. So for example, and to me this is extreme, the Abravanel, if you look at, I think, the beginning of Perek Daled, talks about those who hold, like the Rambam, that the creation of Adam and Chava is allegorical. Does that extend into Cain and Hevel? Okay, because he says if Cain and Hevel are born in Gan Eden, okay, which it never says where they're born. We assume that they were born after Gan Eden because Perek Daled is after they get kicked out. But if they were born in Gan Eden, then is that still considered part of the Torah's presentation of the second story of the creation of man? And you also see that Adam's birth of Shes is the only one described as Kidmuso B'Tzalmo. So like, where does the allegory stop and the literal account begin? It's an open question. The Abravanel ends up concluding that the Rambam would not hold that Cain and Hevel are allegorical. But he raises it as a question. So I just don't know, both in terms of how to navigate that area or like what the reasoning is behind each of the sides. So it's a good question. I just don't know it.
I think didn't Rebbe say that Cain was born before the cheit and Hevel was born after?
It's possible he said that. I mean, I haven't listened to all of Rebbe Shiurim on Gan Eden. Yeah.
She says that.
What was that?
Rashi says that Cain was born before him.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so yeah.
One more question. So
sure.
Back to the in defense of taking an allegorical approach, there was one that it goes against the rationality.
Yeah.
Right. That being one of the issues why you should take it out
Right.
allegorical. So I understand when something goes against the Yesod Torah, like
Yeah.
anthropomorphism of God, but that opens up the door to doesn't that have serious issues, implication for, let's say, like Nisim in the Torah.
Right. I mean, that's the big...
then I don't see how you're gonna draw distinctions over there.
I know that's, so I was going to incorporate this into this year, but I decided not to. Sadigon says there are 4 reasons you take psukim not literally. He says if it's machish, the chushim, if it goes against your senses, like the man called his name's wife Chava because she was the mother of all the living, right? And it's clear that she is not the mother of donkeys and cows, right? The second one is if it goes against rationality. The third reason you take it not literally is if there's a contradiction in the psukim, you have to take something not literally. And the fourth one is if you have a torah bal peh that says that this is not literal, like ayin takas ayin, right? So numbers 1, 3, and 4 are very easy. Okay, no one can disagree with the contradiction in the psukim. It goes against the senses, but saying it goes against rationality, yeah, like that's where you got a lot of debate, and you do have a lot of debate among the Mefarshim about what you take literal because it's irrational, non-literal because it's irrational. Yeah, that opens the door. It's a big question, and it's sarachiyun. I mean, that's part of the methodology. Okay, so let's switch gears into a chumash shiur now. Okay, and again, we're going to end by the time. I was worried, but I'm not worried anymore. Okay, so quick review of Bereshit, the 6th day. Okay, not the whole 6th day, just the creation parts of it. V'yomer Elokim totzeh ha'aretz nefesh chaya lemina behema v'remes v'chayso eretz lemina v'hi chen. God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, livestock, creeping things, wild animals of every kind, and so it was. God made the wild animals of every kind, livestock of every kind, and all the creeping things of the ground of every kind, and God saw that it was good. God said, let us make man, we'll just say in our image like our likeness. We're going to talk about what that means, obviously. And they will rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the animals, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created the man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, classic questions, problems. What is meant by na'ase adam b'tzelmenu kidmusenu? Okay, and I highlighted that there because of the plural problem. But the real question is, what does that whole phrase mean? You can break this into many questions. What does tzelem elohim mean? Is it Elohim or Elohim, right? Is it a reference to in the image of God or in the image of the angels or in the image of both? Okay, that's machlokes in the Mefarshim. Specifically, what does tzelem mean if neither God nor the angels has an image or a form? Okay, what does demus Elohim mean? And why kidmusenu and not bidmusenu? What is the relationship between tzelem and demus? Okay, and what is indicated by the plural? Okay, those are the major questions on that pasuk. Okay, so we're going to try to answer that. Then in the second creation account, Bereshit Beis Zayin, vayitzer Hashem Elokim es ha'adam afar min ha'adama vayipak be'apav nishmas chayim vayi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. Hashem Elokim formed the man from dust of the earth and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Okay, so basic question: what's going on in that pasuk, and how would we reconcile it with the other pasuk? Okay, so classic questions. Now, I think many of us are familiar with, to some extent, with the Rambam's approach to this, and I deliberately am choosing to not go into the Rambam's approach because this is a shiur on Sforno. But as you hear this, you're going to be tempted, if you know the Rambam's approach, to make assumptions that the Sforno is saying the same thing as the Rambam, and just be aware that you shouldn't make those assumptions. Okay, it will end up in a similar place, but it's a different derech. Okay, so here's what he says. Okay, this is a juicy pshat here. Here we go. V'yomer Elokim na'aseh. Okay, so God said, let us make. Nasan az koach b'famalya shalo lahashpia es hatzelem b'nose hamuchan lo. Then God endowed his family on high, okay, the celestial entourage, the angels, with the power to impart the tzelem to the subject prepared for it. Okay, what does that mean? One more comment. Adam. Okay, so what does Adam mean? A species among the types of nefesh chaya, of living creatures, which were talked about earlier on day 6. Sheyetzarti, that I formed, sheshmo Adam, who is named Adam, ka'amro, as it says, vayhi ha'adam lenefesh chaya, as it says, let us make him in our image. Sorry. As it says, man became a living being. Na'asehu bitsalmenu. Let us make him in our image. Shu etzem nitzchi v'sichli, which is an eternal and intellectual essence. Uvazeh pasach hakel yisbarach pesach b'toraso liknos yadia ba'atsamim hanivdalim b'yadias nafsheno. In this way, God, may he be blessed, opened a gateway in his Torah for acquiring knowledge of separate existences through knowledge of our own soul. Now, did anyone catch what the difference is between the way that we think of the phrase Na'aseh Adam b'Tzelem Elokim Musenu and the way Sforno is learning it? Just in terms of the grammatical reading of let us make man in our image like our likeness. Very subtle. Yeah, Yaakov?
So the man usually think this being the what of what we are.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's how we're made.
Okay, that's a good characterization. Okay. Anyone else? Or just in your own words, what is Sforno saying happened? Okay, so I'll summarize, but then we'll talk about it. So he's saying, Bereshis Aleph Chaf Vav is not telling us that God made a creature called man, B'Tzelem Elohim. Rather, it's telling us that God took a creature called man and made him via the angels into a tzelem Elohim. Okay, the key word here is na'asehu b'Tzelmenu. Okay, and for this, I'm going to just demonstrate just a little bit. This is a benefit of if you've been working on an area and you've been feeding everything into ChatGPT and you ask it, like, I didn't know the grammatical way to talk about this, okay? So after like going through all this, I just asked ChatGPT, like, can you put this in grammatical terms? Okay, so here's where it says, oops.
Absolutely. The key difference lies in the subject of the verb and the implied object. In the standard reading, na'aseh Adam, let us make man, is the direct object of the verb na'aseh, let us make. The phrase implies the creation of something new. Let us create a man in our image after our likeness. Sforno, however, interprets na'aseh as a verb with an implied direct object. Let us make him into our image. Here, Adam is not the direct object, but rather the subject being transformed or elevated into tzelem Elohim. So it's not about creating man from scratch, but rather about refining or ennobling an already existing human being.
Okay, yeah. So that I think that I do think this is different than the way that we think of it. I think we think of it as God said in that pasuk, I'm going to make the fully formed man. But what Sforno is saying is God created animals on day 6, okay, land animals. One of those nefesh chayas is called an Adam, and then God endowed the Pamalia Shalmala to impart the tzelem into that animal, okay, and develop that animal into being B'Tzelem Elokim, okay, which I maybe right here, I feel like you've made this point in an evolution thing before, right? That, you know, Sforno was obviously like 250 years before Darwin, but like it happens to be that not as an apologetic reading, but this does happen to work out very well as a description for what we know human development was like. In other words, you had like a pre-tzelem Elokim hominin, or whatever you call it, like a human-like creature, and that developed a tzelem Elokim through, especially if you take the angels, the way that the Rambam says is the angels are natural laws, you know? Okay, but this is gonna get even more rich in the Pshat here, okay? Another point Sforno is making is he's defining the term Elohim. Okay, he says an Elohim is an etzem nitzchi v'sichli, an eternal intelligent essence. Okay, which he's going to elaborate on in a little while. And he makes a third point, which I'm just going to hold on a second. Okay, actually, how do I want to do this? Yeah, so I just want to quickly draw on Sforno's book Or Amim, which is like, again, his more Nevuchim. We don't need to do that. He just has a little bit more of an explanation here. He ties this to a specific, I don't know if it's Neoplatonic or Averroes' view of the relationship between the angels and the material world. So look there if you want to understand from a Aristotelian point how that worked. That's above my pay grade. Okay, and then I just want to comment briefly on this last thing. He says, in this way, God, may he be blessed, opened a gateway in his Torah for acquiring knowledge of separate existences through knowledge of our own soul. Any clue as to what that might mean? He's saying God made man into a eternal intellectual essence, and that is an opening to gain knowledge of God through our own soul. What does that mean? Interesting. He's able to think outside of himself. I mean, that's certainly consistent with what he's saying, but I don't know if that is. I don't know if that's what he's saying. I'll tell you what I think he's saying. Tell me if this fits into the words. Is he saying that if we had nothing that was separate from matter, so then we would have no way to interact with that in any way? But our soul is an elohim, is related to being separate from matter. So through knowing this example of an existence that's separate from matter, we can know other things that are separate from matter. Okay, and in Oramim he says, just slightly more wordy, he says, this is indicated by the verse, let us make man in our image after our likeness. By saying in our image, it refers to the human intellect, which is the intellectual soul. Calling it the image of Elohim, it reveals that it is a separate, transcendent nature and therefore eternal. Furthermore, it implies that by understanding the nature of this intellect, which we can discern through its actions, we can attain some knowledge of God, blessed be he, and of the separate transcendent entities. In other words, we can't have any positive knowledge of a non-physical existence, but you could see its effects. And what is the most local example of a non-physical thing that you can gain knowledge of by seeing its effects is your own tzelem elohim. Okay, I don't know if that's what he's saying. It's not central to our topic, but I just want to mention it. Okay, so now he goes on. He says, what does kidmusenu mean? And this is where I think the Rambam does not interpret it this way. Okay, kidmusenu.
Rosh, can you ask?
Yes.
Just one thing. There's the famous Chazal that analogizes the soul to God. I mean, shockingly,
Right.
but in terms of those features, but you know, it certainly fits in to that framework as a stepping stool and to allow us to at least observe.
Yeah, that's good.
The analogy.
If anyone, the Avram ben Rambam interprets that statement that Donnie is referencing of saying the ways that the soul is similar to God, which sounds heretical, you know, but I mean, the Pshat also seem to imply that. Avram ben Rambam, which by the way, on Alator, they now have the good Avram ben Rambam with all the footnotes. So yeah, so you could look into that. Okay, kidmusenu, like our likeness. So again, Elohim, according to Sforno, is etzem sichli, nitzchi v'sichli. And then kidmusenu is b'inyan hamasios, is in regards to actions. Shi'adame bam ktsas lepamaya shamala, man resembles to some extent the celestial entourage, angels, b'tzad mashem polim b'yadia v'hakara, because they act with knowledge and awareness. Amnam, however, ulasam hi bilti b'chiriis, their action is not by choice. And that's, in that way, man does not resemble them. And in some ways, man resembles God, who does act with free choice. Amnam, however, God's bechira is always for good, and man's bechira is not. God's bechira is on a higher level than man's bechira. That's why it says it is like our likeness and not in our likeness. Okay, and don't ask about the pasuk later on that says bidmusa. No, that's about I think that's about Adam and Chase. Okay, uv amru kidmusenu, and in saying like our likeness, hodia shihi pol biyadiya v'hakara. So it's saying that man acts with knowledge and recognition. Ubezeh yidami lakel yisbarach u'lamalachav, and man is similar to God and his angels. So we're going to now switch to calling this tzelem elohim, because he's using elohim to refer to anything that is non-physical and rational. And this is not true. Oh, I forgot this is in Oramim. This is not true of things that act by nature alone. Resemblance occurs in form, and form is only known through the actions, and that's why it says kaf. Okay, I think including this in case I wanted to quote it. I'm going to skip here. Okay, so what do we see from here? Demus elokim means acting with knowledge and awareness. And kidemus elohim means that man, like angels, acts with knowledge, but unlike angels, he has free will. Man, like God, acts freely, but unlike God, man can choose Ra, whereas God only chooses Tov. So it's so now you put it all together, you've got tzelem elohim, which we haven't explained tzelem yet. That's referring to just the phenomenon of man's rationality and eternality. And then kidmusenu is referring to the fact that we act like angels, unlike God, with knowledge and awareness, but unlike angels, we have free will, and unlike God, we can do bad. Okay, that's so both facets of man's tzelem elohim, of man's what makes him unique. Okay, now he says b'tzelem elohim. What does that mean? The term elohim here, by way of analogy, refers. Al tad hayidamos te'amer al kol etzem sichli befoal shalim nivdal mechomer ubezehu nitchi behechreach. So he expands his definition here. He says Elohim refers to any intellectual essence in actuality, okay, as opposed to, we'll see, potentiality, shalim, complete or intact, nivdal mechomer, separate from matter, and because of those qualities, it is eternal of necessity. Because the only things that are not eternal have material components, and that's what causes them to deteriorate. But if it's completely immaterial, it can't deteriorate. That's why we say it about God and his angels. And we know Elohim also means judges, right? Like Elohim los kalel. Why do we call shoftim by Elohim? Based on the rational component that it has in them. It's lahavdil, like how we call people intellectuals, right? We call them intellectuals, even though intellect is only one component of them, but they're hopefully characterized by their intellect. So that's why we call our shoftim intellectuals, okay? So now we have another step. Oops. Oh, we have an upgrade. So he used to say Elohim meant etzem nitzli v'sichli. Now he expands it. Is etzem sichli b'foal shalim nivdal mechomer ubzehu nitzli b'hekreach. Okay, that's what it means, Elohim. And we're only missing one piece, which is tzelem. Okay, and this is another difference from the Rambam. He says, Amnam biyos ki asechal hanushi afal pi shepulas haskalaso he. I'm going to read this in English. This is easier. However, even though human reasoning functions without any material medium, expanding to that which is non-perceptible, meaning with the senses, and to a limited extent, even into the future, nor does this power weaken through much use or with age, but increases in strength, which demonstrates that man's reason is also without a doubt separated from matter, seeing that the opposite is true of all physical material powers. Breathe. Okay, what is he saying? He's saying here that, I don't think he's making a rigorous philosophical argument. He's saying if you look at how the tzelem elohim operates, you can see that it's not physical, because physical thing, first of all, the tzelem elohim can perceive non-physical realities, okay, abstract truths, okay, whereas let's say an animal intellect cannot perceive abstract truths, okay. Two, man can think about the future, which is also not actually existing, whereas animals cannot think about the future. You know, a beaver that builds a dam, or a squirrel that is collecting, nuts or whatever, preparing for whatever squirrels do, a bear going to hibernation. It looks like it's preparing for the future, but that's just operating on instinct. It's not actually thinking, well, what happens if there's like a hurricane and like I need to like have a contingency plan, So the fact that man can think about the future is another unique feature of human intelligence. And then he says that if something is physical, then it weakens with age and use. But the tzelem elohim only gets stronger. Okay, the more, I mean, not guarantee that it's going to get stronger, halavai, but the older you get and the more you use it, the stronger it gets. So he says all of this shows that it is not a material faculty. Okay, now side problem, it's a little bit too strong for him to say that the intellect operates without any material medium. I mean, Sforno was a physician, and I don't know how much they knew about the brain, but they knew that if you hit someone on the head, they stop thinking, right? And so I'm a big fan of Mortimer Adler's pithy phrasing of the relationship between the non-physical mind and the physical brain. He says, you don't think with your brain, but you can't think without it. Meaning that the thing that thinks is the tzelem elohim, but it needs a physical organ to operate through, which is why with injuries or with dementia or whatever, then it can inhibit the functioning. So I doubt Sforno was like ignorant of that, but I just don't know what it means it's without any. His point though is that the tzelem elohim is non-physical. Okay. Then he says, nevertheless, kodem shizbonin, before a person engages in contemplative understanding, bioso az mushulal mikol shlemus, when he's void of all perfection, asher huchanla, which was made for him, lo yikare Elohim, he's not called Elohim, aval yikare tzelem Elohim bilvad, he's called a tzelem of Elohim, okay, ad sheyikne shlemus, until he acquires perfection. Especially through chachma that gives you love of God and fear of God. Then he will be in etzem sichli in actuality, shalem, whole, nivdal mechomer, separate from matter, and then he will be necessarily eternal after the death of his body. Okay, so in other words, man starts off merely as a tzelem Elohim, as an image or a shadow or a potential Elohim, but he has to actualize it through gaining knowledge that gives him avas Hashem and yiras Hashem. Okay, and bios b'chiras adam liknos zeh hashlemus b'shtadlo lisbonim b'chachma hanis keres, since it's within man's choice to attain this perfection through his efforts in contemplation and wisdom, he's bar. It's clear shekasher yimna atzmo mizeh. If a person refrains from doing this, meaning if he doesn't use his mind, yishar kocho hasichli al koch yuso, then his rational faculty will remain in a state of potentiality, mishulal mikol shleimus b'fol, without any actual perfection, kamoshai b'chila, like it was in the beginning, v'yali b'tohu v'yovad, and it'll come up to nothing and perish. Ka'amra, as it says in Tehillim Mem Tes Chaf Aleph, Adam bi'ikara v'lo yavin, nimshal kapemos nidmo. Man in his splendor, but without understanding, is likened to the beasts that perish. Ves kol ele, burak elis brak b'shtei milos b'amro, b'tzelem elohim. All of this got indicated with these two words, tzelem elohim. Okay, it's a nice little amazing compactness of Devar Hashem, right? So he's saying tzelem is a mere image of Elohim. Man is created to be potentially Elohim, but he has to actualize his seichel. Okay, and this is weighing in, by the way, on a big machlokes. This is a side point, but I think it's an interesting one. There's a Gemara about Beis Hillel Mishamai arguing about whether it was better for man to be created or not. Right, and they argued for 2.5 years, and then Nimnu V'Gamru, they took a vote, and the verdict was Tov Shelo Nochlo Shelo Nivra, right? Better for man not to have been created, and then they say now that he's been created, what should he do? Yifashvish Masav or Yimashvish Masav. He should like analyze his actions. So I know Rebbe has a shiur on that, which is I don't know where it is, but it's a psychological explanation. The Sefer HaIkarim says that that's a machlokus about what the soul is. He says this machlokus is the soul an etzem ruchani, or is it a koach hiulani? Is it a spiritual essence, or is it a material potentiality? Okay, and he says if the soul, and forget in particular what those means, he says if the soul is an essence, like something that exists before you were born, and then God puts it into your body, so then it's better to not be created, because it was in this pure realm, right? And then God put it into you, and now it's subject to cheit and to degradation and all this other stuff. But if you hold that the soul is a potentiality, so then it's definitely better to be created, because you can't be actualized as a soul unless you're put into a physical existence and can actualize it. And the Sefer HaKaim holds that Chazal voted for the first one. Okay, and it's interesting. That's where the Sefer HaKaim also talks about. He says that's the basis of the Chachmei HaKabbalah believing in Gilgul, but he doesn't hold by Gilgul, okay? Because he says you can only have Gilgul if the soul is something that could go from one body into the other, but if it's a potentiality, then it's only going to be actualized once. But my point is that Sforno falls clearly on the other side, that the tzelem elohim is a potentiality that has to be actualized, it doesn't like pre-exist with its knowledge beforehand. Okay, so that is his explanation of Bereshis Perek Aleph. Any questions on this? And then we just got one more step.
What does Bitsalmenu mean?
So Bitsalmenu means with in having an etzem nitzli v'sichli, having a rational essence that is separate from matter and eternal, in man's case, it's only B'Tselem Elohim, because when he's created, he doesn't have that in actuality yet, and he has to actualize it.
But like God and angels, they never have potentiality.
Yeah, so that's why he's saying Elohim means befoal, means only actuality.
But when it says Bitsalmenu, I guess God is speaking Bitsalmenu.
Yeah, it's a little bit, yeah.
Whose potential, man only has the potential?
Right, it's a bit of a difficult reading. I think this is why without going into the particulars, Rambam does not learn tzelem as potentiality, right? And so he can actually say, it's man has the potential to be like God. To be like God. Yeah, that's a little bit of a weakness in the reading, but I think the rest of it works out well. Okay, any other questions on this? Okay, last step is in the second creation account. Vayitzer Bereshis Beis Zayin. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim es Adam afar min ha'adama v'yipach be'apav nishmas chayim v'hi ha'adam l'nefesh chaya. Hashem Elokim formed the man dust from the earth and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. Now, if I ask you what's your go-to Pshat for this, what do you say? What's the classic explanation? I think there's a classic explanation. Yeah, Targum, right? So Onkelos famously says, God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a speaking spirit. And speaking here is referring to the faculty of human speech, which is related to human thought. So Onkelos is learning this as another description of God creating the fully formed man. Sforno does not. Okay, here's what Sforno says. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim, Omnam lahavayas balei chaim lo hispik zeh. I'm kind of quoting him mid-sentence. To make living beings, this alone was insufficient. Okay, whatever was said in the first 6 psukim. Aval haisa yetziras hayotzer yisbarach ofani mischafim. God created this in different ways. V'zeki litziras ha'adam bir afar min ha'adama chelik nechba mimena. He took a distinguished part of the earth. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Nefesh chiyunis, which is I don't know if we have a good English word for this, but the biological vital soul, which gives creatures life, like what the Rambam would call the neshama, meaning the thing that makes you alive, the physiological soul. Okay, so that's the soul that God breathed into him. Muchenes lekabel tzelem elohim, which is prepared to receive the tzelem elohim. Amru, as it says in Eov 32:8, v'nishmas shakai tivinem, that the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding. Mikol makom, which seems to support Anglos, but he says Mikol makom vayhi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. Yet man was still just a nefesh chaya. Im kozer chaya bilvad bilti midaberes. Man was still just a living creature without speech until he was created b'tzelem u'b'dmus. So what he's saying, unlike Unclos, Sforno learns that Bereshis Beis Zion is describing the creation of man's body, the pre-tzelem Elohim one, not the fully formed tzelem Elohim. Okay, so that's describing the Na'aseh Adam part, but b'talminu b'kidmusenu is later. Okay, then Sforno goes on. Nope. Oh, Psukim go on. Vayita Hashem Elohim Gan Eden Mikedem Vayasam Sham Es Adam Asher Yatzar. God planted a garden in Eden in the east, or Mikedem, whatever, and he placed there the man that he formed. Vayatzmach Hashem Elohim min Adama Kol Eitz Nechem Lamar V'Tov L'Machal V'Eitz HaChaim B'Soch Gan V'Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. And God caused to sprout from the earth every tree that's pleasant to see and good for eating, and a tree of life in the middle of the garden, and a tree of Das Tov Ra, which we're not going to translate until next year. Asher Yatzar, Sforno says, Achar she Yatzaru ba'ofen ha'ofen ha'nichbad, she yizkir hinichu sham, lioso makom muchan l'kabbalas tzelem elokim. So he put him in Gan Eden after he formed him, which is a place suited for the receiving of the tzelem elokim, ulosav hasichlios, and for intellectual activity, ba'avir uvimazonos, with appropriate air and sustenance. So physically, it's well suited for the tzelem elokim. And vayatzmach mizonosav shlo b'tzar, he caused food to grow there without suffering. So man didn't have to worry about like working hard for food. Nechman l'mareh, interesting, misameach umarchiv halev. It brings joy and is mind expanding, which is what Chazal use sometimes for like psyche comforting, you know. L'kabbalas hashefa hasichli, to receive intellectual influence. Kamru, as it says, v'hayak nagin hamanagin, bati alav yad Hashem. That by Elisha Hanavi, it says, when the musician played music, the hand of Hashem was upon him to receive prophecy. So in other words, why do you need music for prophecy? Just plain Pshat? What? Be in a good mood, right? So Gan Eden was set up physically and psychologically for man to have the ideal conditions to develop his tzelem Elohim. Okay, now here is the radical Pshat. God took man and placed him in the garden to work it and to preserve it, or to guard it, or to watch it. Okay, fine, with the trees. Now, most people would learn l'avda u'lashamra to mean what? To work and protect what? The garden, right? But grammatically, what's the problem with that? It's feminine, right? So Sforno says, la'avda, la'avod es nishmas chayim, to work his neshama, which was mentioned earlier in the psukim, ka'amru vayipach, and to guard his neshama, vayipach b'pav nishmas chayim, okay, that nefesh chiyunis, u'lashamra, and to guard it, shaloti pasid b'hatachas halechus hasharashi hanitach b'chom hativi, so that it should not be diminished through the impact of nature's heat upon his fundamental vitality. We're not going to explain this time, but this came from all of the fruits there, which constantly replaced what was lost. So he's saying, what he's describing here is God placed man in the Gan. So God did not create man fully formed and then put him in the Gan. He created the nefesh chaya of Adam, put him in the Gan, and that's where he would develop his tzelem elokim and to protect his physical existence into fully develop into man. So the point I'm trying to extract from this is, according to Sforno, man's development was still going on by design in the Gan. Okay, and it was in that context that he gave him the instructions about the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra and Eitz HaChaim. Okay, yeah.
What does develop as self mean in order to develop potential to develop?
Sorry, I was using our language to develop as a tzelem elokim from potential to actual.
But he had the potential before.
He had the potential before, right? Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is, when it says lekabel es hatzelem, does it like what did the angels give him the potential in the garden, or was given like the first seed and he didn't start actualizing until the garden? I'm not sure where the cutoff is there. Yeah. Right. That's a good question also. I mean, it's a good question. there's a good, oh man, there's a good, Ibn Ezra, I meant to look this before. Ibn Ezra on Tehillim Ches, which is that phrase that Christians like from the mouth of babes. Ibn Ezra there talks about how the beginning of the tzelem elohim development is from a baby's ability to start speaking. And I wanted to look at the Sforno there and see what he says about that, to look at exactly where that line was about what is by constitution, just pure potentiality, and when you start to actualize it. I don't know the exact answer. Okay, so just to summarize how he's answering our questions, and then we'll end for today, is man was created with the capacity to become, quote, an actually existing intelligent essence, complete, separate from matter, and thus necessarily eternal, so that's tzelem elohim, that's elohim, but the capacity is tzelem elohim, who acts with knowledge, that's kidmus elohim, which is like God and the angels, kaviyachol, but only if he develops that potentiality, which he did in Gan Eden, where he was placed to develop that fully, okay? And I did not write my concluding thoughts, but let's just summarize the takeaway from here, okay? So we had yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah.
Which word was
Demus. Yeah. Kidmusenu is referring to like God in acting with knowledge, but God only acts for good, but man can act for evil. And then it's like the angels in that they also act with knowledge, and angels don't have free will at all.
You were saying it was two different.
It's two different things. Yeah. Yeah. It's a weird thing. It's like God saying, in narration voice, we angels are going to make man resemble us, but in different ways, Yeah. Okay, so the two takeaway from the first part of shiur is listen to Rabbi Shiur on the Nachash, okay? And the question is, the three harms of allegorizing the Nachash are that it's inconsistent, it goes against the Masorah, and it undermines Torah. That's Rebbe's arguments. The Abravanel, I thought, made a pretty good defense of the Rambam to show that there is a consistency in the sense that the Rambam has his reasons for interpreting just the elements highlighted in the second creation account allegorically. He doesn't touch the 6 days of creation, and he doesn't touch the mitzvos, but specifically the creation of the Isha from the Ish and the Nachash and some of those other things. And it is consistent with the Baalei Masorah because Chazal take it that way, and we have Rishonim who take it that way. And it's not dangerous if you have those parameters, okay? And that's all set up to try to justify the Sforno, which will be next time. And then the other takeaway is Sforno holding this definition of tzelem elohim. And the question is going to be now, what does he do with the Nachash, and how does the Nachash fit into the creation of man? And really, when did man stop developing? Is the whole dialogue between the Nachash and Chava part of that development, or is it after the development and it's a ruining of that development? That'll have to wait until next time. And you could see, I know this is a lot of groundwork today, but I hope you can sympathize and understand how I have to give this shiur before giving the Nachash shiur, and this is worth it for the methodology, I hope, and for the premises. So hope that was worth it. Okay, have a good day. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Rabbi Shneewas.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.